Good morning. This session is being pre-recorded, but feel free to ask questions by using the chat feature located halfway down the page on the right-hand side. My partner and I are happy to welcome you this morning to our session, Beyond Pennsylvania Judge, Language Access in the Keystone State. I'm Mark Dalton. I'm the District Court Administrator in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania, and have been here since 1993, and I'm a longtime member of the National Association for Court Management.
Hi, I'm Mary Vilter. I'm the Coordinator for Court Access at AOPC, the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, working on language access and ADA matters. So let's get started first with a little bit of an overview of our top languages in Pennsylvania. This is based on statistics from 2019. We tend to be fairly similar year to year. Almost always, our top interactions are with Spanish speaking individuals. So that's our most frequently requested language by far. But generally Chinese Mandarin, ASL, Russian, Arabic, Nepali is increasing in various parts of the state, Vietnamese, Korean. So generally those are our top languages most frequently requested, highest volume, though the deck does get shuffled a little bit. We'd be curious what your top languages in your state are. But Mark, how does it differ in Lancaster County?
In Lancaster County, the top language is Spanish, not surprisingly. And we, as you see on the slide here, we call them interactions, which is an opportunity for the court to provide access to individuals in languages that they're requesting. So in Spanish, we had a little over 2,000 interactions in 2019. But you might be surprised to know the other four languages that we have here. Arabic is number 2. We had 54 interactions in 2019. Swahili with 44, Vietnamese 44, and American Sign Language at 34.
That's interesting. So yeah, American Sign Language tends to be one of our top languages, generally right behind Spanish. So this next slide is a view of our statewide interactions. The counties that are in yellow, you see, generally have very limited use of interpreters. But generally, the rest of the state is fairly spread out. I often say not just Philadelphia and Pittsburgh and Allegheny County in the western, and not just Spanish in terms of what our needs are. As you can see, we spent well over $5 million on interpreter interactions in 2019 and had about 45,000 encounters where we used interpreters in our courts. So as you can see, there's a lot of use of interpreters in the southeastern part of the state, and that's where our interpreters tend to be clustered as well. So we're going to talk a little later about our efforts to increase our interpreter pool throughout the state. But that's how it tended to be. Southeastern part of the state, also northeastern. Lehigh County, for example, has a very high Spanish-speaking population. Lucerne, Lancaster, where Mark is as well. So what are we doing in Pennsylvania, and what have we done over the years? Really, my colleague Oswaldo Aviez got us started more than a decade ago through working towards the passage of the Pennsylvania Interpreter Act, which required our Administrative Office of Courts to set up an interpreter certification program. So you're going to hear a little bit more about that from Mark and myself, but that's been in place for a number of years now, certifying interpreters and testing them to work in the courts. It's a very demanding job, requiring a lot of professional expertise. Then we updated our local language access plan several years ago. Each district created their own language access plan. We have 60 judicial districts in the state of Pennsylvania. And then after that, we created a statewide plan to build on some of the progress that districts had made support them, give them some tools for language identification and for monitoring use of language. And then we, as I mentioned before, are seeking now to do an outreach project to reach more interpreter candidates throughout the state. And training we have up here because it's an ongoing process. And I think that helps me to sort of cue up our next slide, which is a video. We've learned by doing training of judges, of language access coordinators. Each of our districts has a language access coordinator, of attorneys themselves, of interpreters, that we need to continuously reinforce the sort of team project aspect of providing language access to our limited English proficient and deaf individuals. So the video you're about to see is all about that. A judge once asked me what would happen to me if I got into trouble in a foreign country. And you're going to see a little bit of an answer to that from Richard Gere, who in this film, which is called Red Corner, portrays a prominent attorney visiting China who was falsely accused of a murder.
Jack Petermore, you are charged with intentional homicide and rape with aggravating circumstances. Does any participant in these proceedings challenge the composition of the court? Procurator Ma.
No challenge, Presiding Chairman.
Does defense aide challenge the composition of the court? Does the defense aide challenge?
I'm sorry, can you please speak a little louder?
Do you challenge the composition of this court, sir? No challenge, Presiding Chairman. Advocate Sheng Yuling. Please excuse me. I was with Division Chief Li at the Ministry of Justice preparing for this case. You excuse the advocate. Accuse Moore. You understand the charges against you.
What I understand is I have never met my attorney before.
Advocate Sheng Yuling. Have you not met with the accused? Presiding Chairman.
Wait a minute. I lost the sound. I can't hear anything. What is she saying? Wait. I don't hear. I lost the sound. Can't hear anything. What? I can't. It's very important that I...
Can you hear me now? Accused Moore?
Can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
I would like my attorney I have never met. She has said...
I told Chairman Xu, I will sign this case only today, but I'm familiar with facts of the investigation.
Familiar with it? How could you? You never once spoke with your client.
You must address the court in the proper manner.
What is the proper manner, Your Honor?
Accused Moore, please be seated now.
Advocate Sheng Yuling, what does the accused plead to these charges? The accused pleads guilty.
What the hell I do?
So there's a lot going on in that video. And you hear Richard Gere, who, as I said, portrays an attorney falsely accused of murder. He says this is very important. And that's something we try and impress upon folks when we're training, that what's at stake when you're a limited English proficient person appearing in a legal system that is not your own, that is literally foreign to you, is significant. Your rights are being determined. And so that's why nationwide we have a high standard for interpreters being certified to work in the courts, and why interpreters are essential. So our interpreter certification program that I referenced earlier, this is a little bit about it. This brochure, by the way, is something that we had translated into Spanish, our most common language, so we can make it available throughout throughout the Commonwealth. We provide 4 interpreter workshops to orient folks to what they need to know and do, and tests they need to take to become certified to work in our courts. We have a number of projects that we're trying to use to increase, as I mentioned before, our pool of interpreter candidates. So, for example, one local bar association is doing an intensive training program to work with candidates who have taken the test before but not obtained a high enough score to actually get on our roster. And that's been a successful partnership with us and the local bar association and the local court. We have our Philadelphia courts, who are by far and away our highest user of interpreters, and they have an interpreter shadowing program where, because they're lucky enough to have staff interpreters, they allow interpreter candidates to shadow those staff interpreters and see what it's like to interpret in the court proceeding. And also they provide some education workshops for those folks. So we're constantly working to increase all of our interpreter representation on our roster, but especially for our lots or languages other than Spanish. This is our compensation schedule, which is competitive with other states. My colleague, the Interpreter Certification Program Director, Oswaldo Avi, has put this together. And it is something that interpreters agree to comply with when they get onto our roster. Did you have a comment about that in terms of Lancaster, Mark?
Yeah, we found here in Lancaster, and many of the judicial districts have found the same thing, is that the schedule allows us, when interpreters come to us, to really point to that schedule in regards to payment. And if they're on the roster, they are obligated to follow the compensation schedule. However, there's certainly been times over the years when certain languages, such as I mentioned some of the languages in Lancaster County, such as Arabic, where it is very difficult to find interpreters, and they know that, and they will often really push us to pay outside of the compensation schedule. But again, it's been helpful for us in when we speak to interpreters, also provides them an understanding of generally what they will be making. Okay, next we have, as we just talked about, the interpreter roster. The point of the interpreter roster, which was set up so that courts know which interpreters have completed or are in compliance with certain program certification requirements. Only interpreters appearing on the roster are eligible for work in the Pennsylvania judicial system. As the slide indicates, currently there are 37 languages and 242 interpreters. However, I will say that changes all the time. Interpreters generally fall into 2 categories: certified and otherwise qualified. The interpreter classification is determined by the level of expertise achieved and the skills demonstrated by interpreters based on their performance in various examinations, which takes place throughout the year. Courts must attempt to obtain a certified interpreter first when looking for an interpreter. Only when a certified interpreter is not readily available are they allowed to use an otherwise qualified interpreter. And there is obviously good reason for that. We want the best and the most skilled. And the type of cases that we really focus on that really do need a certified interpreter are felonies, cases where life, long-term liberty, or property of the defendant is at stake. Certainly in regards to jury trials, we want to make sure that there are certified interpreters.
These are certification requirements. You can read them for yourselves, but generally the idea is that the National Center for State Courts has a whole set of exams that these folks take, including a written exam, an oral proficiency interview, Those are nationally vetted tests that most states require their interpreters to take, just so we can hold folks to a very high standard because of what's at stake in these proceedings.
Mary talked about this a little bit a couple of slides ago in collaborations and partnerships that are very important for us. Again, Mary mentioned Philadelphia, but certainly all the judicial districts to some extent, though, as you might recall in the map that Mary showed, there are some judicial districts or counties throughout the state where the number of interpreters is very, very low. Lancaster County, middle of the road to high. And we are always on the lookout for individuals who may be in the process of certification or may be interested in being an interpreter. We invite them to come and shadow an interpreter, walk around throughout the courts, see what kind of things that they're doing. We want to make sure that they are knowledgeable about the interpreter program here in Pennsylvania, provide them the information, the website information. Always on the lookout for that. The second category is our local County Commissioners Association. That is important because for the 67 counties here, most, if not all, of the commissioners belong to this association. And it's important to the courts because the county commissioners are the funding source for the courts for the most part. We get money in other areas, but certainly they're a very important component of that. And so we want to make sure through the County Commissioners Association that as much information as possible on language access and interpreters can be provided so that when it comes to budget time, they're knowledgeable about what we're expected to do or what the court is expected to do and the type of services that we're required to provide. Also, we work with the state and local bar associations, Lancaster County. We work with and partner with with the folks such as Mary, our colleagues at the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, to come down to our local judicial districts, our local counties, and present at our bar associations. Our bar associations really very much welcome us and really like to have us there to talk about what's going on. It enables us to provide information to the attorneys and give them information on how best to work with the court in making sure that their clients, if there is a language access need, that their client has that information. And certainly one of the things that we emphasize over and over again, make sure that you provide the court the date, time, and need and language which is needed for your client. So we get that information out to our bar associations.
And just to echo that, what Mark's saying about the local bar associations, one of the district court administrators in a neighboring county to Mark's told me that he attends pretty much every local CLE put on by the bar association, then gets up and says, put in your interpreter requests early and often. So that's something that just makes the system work better for everybody. One of the other outreaches that we've done in Pennsylvania, where as part of our interpreter certification program, we certify ASL interpreters as well as foreign language interpreters. Not every state does that. So we've done outreach to our Office of Deaf and Hard of Hearing to keep that pipeline of qualified interpreter candidates coming into our orientations. ASL, we have probably right behind Spanish in terms of the number of interpreters we have on our roster, but we always need more. So we're always looking to increase that. And recently, as part of that outreach program that I mentioned earlier, we've started to do outreach to university language programs to try to get them to consider this a possible career path for their students.
One of the requirements for each of the judicial districts, and I just might mention briefly, there are, as Mary mentioned, 67 counties in Pennsylvania. However, there are only 60 judicial districts. Several of the counties are covered by one judicial district. So each of those judicial districts And it certainly is a requirement that there would be a language access coordinator and that there is a language access plan available for the public to view. This was done about 4 years ago. Each judicial district created their own language access plan and in coordination with the state language access plan. It describes what resources are available at the court, how to request an interpreter in our particular district, for example, what forms we have translated and where to find them. And if you look on the slide, you will see that if you look closely, you can actually see Lancaster County. So that is a portion of Lancaster County's language access plan. It's section 1 of the plan. The other important is our language access coordinators, otherwise known as LACs. The LAC is meant to be the point of contact for each of the judicial districts for all things related to language access, which would including arranging for interpreters, having information available if you need a telephonic interpreter, making sure that the departments and staff in your particular judicial district are properly trained and are knowledgeable about that particular county's language access plan, and coordinating that with the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts if there's a need for that. In going further, a little bit further in regards to our language access plan is that there are some challenges, not surprisingly, for our courts. One is, and we kind of already talked about this, and probably is very prevalent wherever you are, is a shortage of local interpreters. There are some courts which have on staff court interpreters. Lancaster County is not one of those counties. So we're totally dependent on other interpreters who we contract with to provide those services. And because there's needs in surrounding counties, oftentimes, even for the language of Spanish, where interpreters might not always be as accessible as we would like them to be. So that's certainly a challenge. And the other is that because we don't have internal interpreters, and because the court doesn't run all its programs itself, we are often dependent on third-party vendors to provide those. And examples would be that in adult probation or in juvenile probation, they may have programs specific to their clients' needs, usually required at sentencing by the judge. And we have worked with, particularly LAC has worked with these departments to ensure the fact as these contracts come up for renewal, we make sure that there is a portion of the contract that indicates that they're required to provide language access services if needed. And that's done whenever any program gets any federal funding, and the courts obviously certainly do from time to time. And then certainly there's always a challenge to make sure that the forms that we provide, there's many local forms out there, and we want to make sure that if there's a need for those forms, not necessarily all of them, but many of them need to be translated. So we're on the lookout for that. And since our language access plan was put into place, many forms, several hundred forms actually have been translated, but there's always a challenge that there's many more to go. And lastly, there's the cost related to that. And we'll be talking about that, but that is an important portion of that. I talked about working with our funding authority, our county commissioners. And so we put that money in the budget and certainly look toward getting those forms translated when we can. But getting the money necessary to do that and the time necessary to do that is always a challenge.
So one of our themes here is collaboration, and we wanted you to see who was involved in the project of writing a statewide language access plan. Our Supreme Court adopted our statewide plan about 3.5 years ago. And as you see, we had a diverse group. We included, from the bottom here, I'm mentioning this because Mark had talked about involving county commissioners because of the situation in Pennsylvania, where the counties fund a great part of court operations, including paying for interpreters in large part. We also involved the state legislature. We had a state representative and a state senator, and then the usual players that you would expect. From there, we had a sign language interpreter, we had foreign language interpreter, we had district court administrators, including Mark and two of his colleagues, as well as judges at our trial court level, which is common pleas in Pennsylvania, and also our entry-level court, our point of entry to the system, which is our magisterial district courts. We had a judge from Allegheny County, where Pittsburgh is located, who himself regularly uses interpreters. So definitely a team effort. And then as part of the plan itself, the plan required that once it was adopted by our court, that we have a monitoring and evaluation team to actually implement it. So Mark shortly is going to tell you about some of the specific deliverables under the plan that we've spent the last 3.5 years putting into place. But this is the group that actually has done that work all this time. So again, trial court judges, district court administrators, translators, because of what Mark mentioned about the need now to begin the truly mammoth undertaking of translating court forms. In Pennsylvania, we have statewide forms, and then we have many, many individual local court forms. And attorneys and a sign language interpreter. So that's been the group that's been working on actually putting bones on the plan as we've gone forward. So Mark's going to go through some of our deliverables under the plan now.
Yes, and so you see before you one of those deliverables, which is the BENCHCARD. And when we use it word delivery, we're really looking toward, and this is what our monitoring evaluation team looked at, is what could we provide for local courts that would be helpful for them, particularly for those counties in which they may not regularly work with interpreters. And even for those counties that do, bringing them up to speed on what needs to be done and what they should be aware of. So we thought it would be helpful for our judges and our magisterial district courts. So we have common pleas judges, and we have magisterial district court judges, and we have masters and hearing officers. So we wanted to be able to provide them some quick information. And so we devised and put together and produced this BENCHCARD, many of which were laminated. And then we handed them out to the judges and to our hearing officers to ensure the fact that, again, they would have some quick reference material. And so what you see before you is a portion of the card is actually quite large and has lots of information on both sides. And you can see that there's a court checklist that they can go through. There's the oath to swear in the interpreter. There might be a question about who pays for the interpreter, and how they should be appointed, and how to ensure that an interpreter is qualified. And I will say that for those judges who regularly work with interpreters, these cards, though helpful, probably are not used all that often. But referencing again back at the map that showed the various counties, some counties had zero interpreter interactions. And so when they might by any chance need to have an interpreter, it was important for them to have some a quick guide and ready for that information. One of those important points is to acknowledge the fact that there's a lot of interpreting, or there may be some interpreting, depending on where you are, and the need for outside of the courtroom. And those would be at the counter when individuals come up to departments. And so we wanted to have and provide information to the local judicial districts, a quick way to be able to access an interpreter, particularly for those non-Spanish languages. And so the point of this is to provide information that would give them a number to call, an account number for their particular district, the numbers related to a particular language that they might need, and getting that out, and again, training our staff to be using that information whenever the need arises. Next, in regards to our deliverables, is our two particular, I think, very important points of information, not only to get it out when there is a need for an interpreter, having access to the telephonic interpreter, but to even know which language they need to be calling in. And so we provided 2 items and was sent out to all the court departments, and that is the interpreter the interpreter poster, right to interpreter, and the I Speak cards. The right to interpreter posters are supposed to be posted in all court departments and all areas in which the staff might interact with the public. This allows the limited English proficiency person to point to their language, so the court staff will know what language to request an interpreter when they're calling for telephonic interpreting, and so that they can assist the LEP. The second item there on the left-hand portion is the I Speak card, which, unlike the poster, the I Speak card can be portable, can be walked around with them. They can keep it with them. Once they take it, they can keep it with them wherever they go. Each judicial district was sent these cards in their particular top 5 languages. And here we put them out, put little holders for the cards, and so that somebody could look down, look at their particular language, and then be able to identify for the staff person what language it is. On this particular slide, it happens to be Russian. On one side is the Russian language. On the other side is the English language. And again, helps both the individual, the LEP, and the staff person to be very aware of what the language is. And obviously, it's very important to be as accurate as possible for that language. Next is a very important component of everything that we're doing here. It's not only important that when people come to the counter or when they're in the courtroom, that they know that they have access to an interpreter if necessary. And that one of the ways we do that is through our notice of language rights. We want to make sure that everything that gets sent out in which there is a need for a party in a case, they may be a witness or a victim, or like I said, a party, or the person in loco parentis, if they're required to attend a hearing or file a document or some sort of action, we want to make sure that they understand that they have the right to an interpreter. And so the notice of language rights goes on the various notices that are automatically sent out. But there's certainly occasions when things are not automatically generated, and we also want to make sure that those individuals know that they have the right to an interpreter. So the way we've done it, at least in Lancaster County, and this is not done in all judicial districts, but we've done it here, is we've placed the notice of language rights on all our envelopes, so that when anything ever goes out, whether or not it's on the notice or not, it will show up on the through the envelope. And if you look closely, you will see on this particular notice of language rights, Lancaster County, the language access coordinator information is available. And again, that's put on every envelope that goes out. One of the things that we're also required to provide to the public is an opportunity for them to provide or to submit a complaint. So if there's a situation that they felt that their language access need was not properly met, we want to give them an opportunity to file a form. And this form is required to be on all the judicial districts are required to have it on their website and provide it, if necessary, in writing at the counter if requested. The complaint form can be completed by anyone, whether it's the LEP themselves, the attorney for the LEP, a non-attorney advocate. Anybody can fill out the form. When the language access coordinator, sometimes in conjunction with the court administrator, receives the form, we are obligated to investigate it, find out what happened, and come to some sort of resolution. Once that's done, we put that on a tracking form, and then twice a year, that form is sent up to the Administrative Office of Pennsylvania Courts, and they track all the language access complaints across the state.
Okay, and one of the things we mentioned earlier, well, you saw it, really, a reflection of it was our statewide map and our list of our top languages. That was gleaned from this language access data collection, which we refer to as LADC. So we created this years ago when we started ramping up our language access efforts to help us at the state level and to help the local courts. Some of them had their own methods for tracking provision of language access. Some of them who were less frequent users of interpreters didn't have a method, and we needed to get our arms around what languages we were providing interpreters for, how much we were spending statewide, where there might be problems, what case types we were seeing interpreter use for most frequently. So that's why we created this application, which all of our districts now use. What you see in the left-hand corner is reports that they can self-generate whenever they want. If a district, say Mark wants to know, in 2019, did I have a greater use of Haitian Creole than I had seen previously? It seems anecdotally to me like I heard that, but is that true? He could generate a report, or his language access coordinator can for him. If he feels like maybe I need to pay attention to my domestic relations forms because I feel like we're using a lot of interpreters in that part of our court, he would be able to track that by the case type report. So we have that feature. We have in the center part of your screen, the language access data collection is an announcement feature where we keep folks apprised of training opportunities, resource materials, what's happening in language access at the state level. And then in your lower left-hand corner, you can see there's a training materials link that you can get to.
Okay, one of the most important deliverables, certainly at the local level, is the bilingual employee policy. That was something that was worked on very hard by the monitoring and evaluation team. And the reason for that is to set out to assess and to train bilingual employees who are using their bilingual skills to assist the LEP and the deaf and hard of hearing court users. Some of the main components of the bilingual employee policy is to encourage, identify, recruit, retain qualified employees who have bilingual skills in order so that they can communicate directly and effectively with certain court users. They set out to test, and we've done this quite often and is required throughout the state to set out and test a bilingual staff for direct communication by assessing their bilingual skills. In Pennsylvania, we have a couple of commercially available language skill tests that are online and telephone based. The policy requires the use of the Federal Interagency Language Roundtable, or the ILR scale, with a minimum elementary proficiency level of 2. But we really look for higher proficiency level for certain type of positions, such as probation officers, where there are more complex interactions taking place with the LEP. In regard to sign language, we assess that through 2 tests, the ASLPI, which is the American Sign Language Proficiency Interview, and the SLPI, which is the Sign Language Proficiency Interview. If the ASLPI is used to assess language skills, we really look for a skill level of 2. And if the SLPI test is used, we're looking for something which is called the Survival Plus level. And this next point is important because I think one of the hardest things for us to meaning the LAC and the court administrator, to work with judges and with staff to understand is that there is a difference between being bilingual and using their bilingual skills and being an interpreter. And so we've worked very hard to try to train and get out that information to them so that they understand it is not appropriate for bilingual employees to do interpreting. And we want to make sure that the bilingual employee who is using their skills and has been tested, that they also understand that they're not to use legal advice. One of the other components, and this varies throughout the state of Pennsylvania, is pay. There are probably some areas in which the bilingual employee over the last many years has been compensated for their bilingual skills. That did not take place in Lancaster County. It was added to their job description, but there wasn't necessarily an additional compensation given for those skills. We wanted to change that in Lancaster County, and we worked very hard, many months, worked with all the departments to truly identify who those individuals are. And out of about 500 folks, we had about 50 people who were identified as needing their bilingual skills were needed. And then we went about the process of testing them. And then, again, working with our county commissioners, we're able to get some additional compensation from them because they understood what we were doing and what our program was about. So next is, and this was mentioned briefly in one of the other slides, is there is often a need for a language access need outside of the courtroom. And I kind of view this in two ways. One is the internal, which is the court, and one is the external programs. And this is often provided by vendors. Title VI requires the federal recipients like courts provide access to all their programs, services, and activities. This means that in addition to providing interpreters for court proceedings, other court-administered and court-managed programs have to be interpreted or translated for LAPs when there is a need. However, that being said, sometimes there is some difficulties related to that. Some vendors are very small vendors and may not have or have to work up toward providing the language access for clients who are coming to their particular program. So we've also worked with our judges so that they understand that there may be a time in which they will not be able to be used in that particular program. So a judge may identify that an individual needs to go to a program, but may decide not to do that in this particular case if language access needs cannot be met. So, and that's really the latter part of this particular slide. And again, important that it's identified as quickly as possible when there is a need, and to make sure that that individuals are in compliance and that programs and vendors are in compliance with that.
So we've talked a lot about collaboration, and you're seeing it here because Mark's a local court representative and I'm at the AOC level. But one thing I want to highlight is how much the local courts who have been providing language access and been the on the ground people doing this work for many years, how much they've helped to develop policy at the state level. For example, LADC, language access data collection that I talked about earlier. We had a focus group of local district court administrators, folks in Mark's job from across the state, high LEP counties, low LEP counties, geographically diverse, who helped us put together LADC and gave us feedback about improvements. And we're going to be updating that application shortly, as a matter of fact, based on local feedback. We had an implementation group of DCAs who met with us in particular to give us feedback about implementing the Notice of Language Rights that Mark spoke about earlier. That's been really key, and one of our local court judges, actually several MDJ, magisterial district judges, said, that's one of my biggest problems is folks showing up and me finding out for the first time when they're before me that they need an interpreter. And so you should develop some kind of mechanism for folks to know that they have a right to an interpreter and contact the court and request the interpreter ahead of time. So that was based partially on local feedback. And then the things that Mark just spoke about, the bilingual employee policy and the services beyond the courtroom policy, both are spoken about in the plan, but the services beyond the courtroom in particular, as you can tell by what Mark was telling you about, is a complex issue. I think we've really mastered people knowing that they have to provide interpreters for free to LEPs for court proceedings, but all of these programs that judges might order folks to comply with, that's a whole raft of, DUI classes and parenting classes and all sorts of things that we now have to think about providing language access to. And so our local court administrators helped us to know what we should talk about and what guidance they needed. And they helped a lot with the bilingual employee policy. Because as Mark said, their first step sort of in implementing that policy was to figure out how many bilingual employees they even had and how many of them were actually using their skills to help limited English proficient folks on a daily basis. So the local courts have been a tremendous help in implementing policies. This is another thing that we've gotten a lot of help from our monitoring and evaluation team and from the National Center for State Courts. Mark spoke earlier about the challenge of translating court forms. And so the translation group of the monitoring and evaluation team worked with the National Center for State Courts to develop this UJS translation policy and procedures manual to help us really figure out with the very intimidating task of translating our documents, how to identify which ones are vital and therefore under the DOJ guidance must be translated in order for us to be in compliance with Title VI. And then prioritizing what to translate, which form should we get to first. And then into what languages. DOJ has a lot of guidance on that. So now we're working with a newly enhanced translation committee to actually get down to the work of doing all this prioritizing and actually translating ultimately. Our website is a resource for everybody that we've recently beefed up. This is what it looks like. Our language access and interpreter program has our notice of language rights up on it. As you can see, it has links on the right-hand side to our interpreter program, which of course is our key, most important element of language access. And then you can go to the list of all the language access coordinators throughout the state. And the instructions at the top of that list are in English and Spanish. We have a bilingual forms page that we're hoping to, as I mentioned, increase in volume as we get to translating more forms. Right now, it's mostly protection from abuse forms and some others that are up there. And then recently, we've developed a secure page for our language access coordinators. That's what this is. We wanted to have, and this again is something that Mark at one point suggested. We realized as we were implementing the plan that we were developing a lot of tools and we were developing guidance documents and we were developing trainings. And some of the local court administrators are doing some trainings on their own. So we created a training manual and put that on this site. We put up some of the trainings that we've done over the years so that folks could use them if they wanted. Mark was talking about the bilingual employee policy, and we have a brief video that all bilingual employees and their supervisors are supposed to watch. So that's up here. We have a short video just on general language access issues. So that's up. So it's a place where folks can go and know what's happening at the state level and also get all the resources and tools that they need to do their jobs. State funding is something, again, that Mark touched on. We did several years ago succeed in getting a $1.5 million grant. Our state legislature gives us thankfully annually now. And so that allows us to partially reimburse the districts for what they spend every year on interpreters. And as you can imagine, and I can show it in the next slide, what the districts spend on interpreters has greatly increased even in these last 5 years. When we first were able to get this grant from the legislature, it was about 50-50. Our district spent about $3,000 a year, and the total state grant availability was 1.5. But as you see, we've gone up dramatically as our districts have continued to work so hard at this. And as we have ramped up our efforts at the state level, I think folks are becoming more aware of their right to an interpreter. The districts are working harder and harder to do it. And so we spend a lot more now than we did even a few years ago. We're up to about 5.4 in 2019. So what are we doing now? Looking forward, we've sort of given you a little bit of a summary of what we've done over the last few years. And what we're doing now is really, to the extent that we can do this with all of us in the pandemic, we're continuing to do training. That's just such a critical element of this whole program, and everybody needs to get it. We go to new judge school. We have an annual event in Pennsylvania for judges who are newly elected or recently come to the bench. We do, as Mark mentioned, CLEs, where we partner with the language access coordinator or the DCA for a given judicial district, and we go out and do CLEs for lawyers. We train interpreters. We train language access coordinators. We've talked a lot about outreach to qualified interpreter candidates, and this picture on the right-hand side of your slide is actually one of the last outreach events we were able to do before the pandemic. And Natalia Petrova and Chase Emanuel of our staff were there. Chase is a University of Pittsburgh foreign language graduate himself. And then on the right-hand side are two folks from Allegheny County Court of Common Pleas, Lisa Herbert and Greg Seitz, who've been very helpful in helping us to do outreach in the western part of the state, where they have high interpreter need and low availability. Now we need to work, obviously, and I know all of you are with us on this, probably on increasing our use of remote interpreting. That's probably going to be the way of the future. We've all been doing that for months now and probably are going to continue to do it. And as we've mentioned, translation is going to be really something that we have to work on. So we're going to send you off with something a little humorous here. Speaking of translation, Google Translate is something that you can Google videos on Google Translate and the problems with Google Translate, and see that it's really not an effective way to translate anything of any complexity. And since we're talking about legal documents, those definitely qualify. So we're going to show you a video about that.
Go for it.
Here we go. Okay.
You will be singing the Google Translate version of Can't Feel My Face by The Weeknd. Translated, it is called My Front Is Not Felt. Roots!
Her concern was given and told me. Her concern again was given. Together it is known. action, what I've affection with saying and told me. In your presence, my front is not felt. Hey, it is good. Hey, it is good. Yes, in your presence, my front is not felt. Hey, it is good. Hey, it is good. Yes.
So friends don't let friends use Google Translate. I guess that's the moral of that story.
Okay, so if you have a question or would like to contact us, that is our contact information there for myself, Mark Dalton, and for Mary Filter. It's been wonderful being with you this morning, and we hope this information was helpful. If, as mentioned at the very beginning, if you have any questions, feel free to put it in the chat box, and we'll answer them as best we can. So again, thanks very much.
Thank you.